Okay, good evening, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are in a Singapore or Asian time zone, I know it's very late for you. Thank you for joining us. If you're on the East Coast, I know it's very early for you. I'm so pleased today to welcome Professor Zhou Taomo and Professor Arunabh Ghosh as speakers for this Global Political Thought Seminar event. My name is Ning Chang. I'm a PhD student in political theory at the Department of Government at Harvard University, and I am one of the co-organizers of the Global Political Thought Project. Just a little quick note about the project before we begin. It was started by a few of us at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and a few other partner institutions as a way to continue engaging with all the rich and exciting literature happening within political theory and very much elsewhere as we continue to question and interrogate the boundaries and the premises of political thought as a field, which is why I'm particularly pleased to have our two speakers today who, if I am correct, work outside political thought narrowly defined as a discipline, which I think is a wonderful reflection of where the field is going and promises to go. And I think I'm very excited to have our discipline continually enriched by contributions from speakers such as today's. So today's session, we will be beginning with Professor Zhou's comments on her ongoing work, followed by Professor Ghosh's comments on his ongoing work, and then Kelvin will kickstart the discussion with some on-the-fly comments to the speakers' presentations. Professor Zhou Taomo is an assistant professor of history at Nanyang Technological University, NTU, Singapore, specializing in modern Chinese and Southeast Asian history. Taomo received her BA from Peking University and Waseda University and master's with distinction from the London School of Economics and PhD in history from Cornell University. Her writings have appeared in publications such as the Journal of Asian Studies, Diplomatic History, the China Quarterly, the Critical Asian Studies, the Journal Indonesia, and the Made in China Journal. Taomo's first book, Migration in the Time of Revolution, China, Indonesia, and the Cold War, Cornell University Press 2019, is selected as one of the best books of 2020 by Foreign Affairs and receives an honorable mention for the Henry J. Bender Prize from the Association of Asian Studies. It argues that migration and the political activism of the overseas Chinese were important historical forces in the making of the governmental relations between China and Indonesia during the Cold War. Grounded in multilingual archival research, as well as oral history interviews with refugees, retired diplomats, former political prisoners, and communist exiles, this project demonstrates how state-to-state diplomacy was influenced or even limited by transnational ethnic ties and the daily social and political practices of a minority group. This project also changes how we understand the regime change and mass violence in Indonesia in 1965 to 1966. Having grown up in a migrant family in Shenzhen, the first special economic zone of China, she is also starting a second project on the historical transformation of this modern metropolis, which we will be hearing more about in a few minutes. Professor Ghosh is a historian of modern China with research and teaching interests in social and economic history, history of science and statecraft, transnational history, and China-India history. Arunabh's first book, Making It Count, Statistics and Statecraft in the Early People's Republic of China, was published by Princeton University Press in 2020, and it investigates how the early PRC state built statistical capacity to know the nation through numbers. He has conducted research for the book in Beijing, Guangzhou, New Delhi, and Kolkata, and his work has been supported by grants and fellowships from the Andrew F. Mellon Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Social Science Research Council, and Columbia University. His work has appeared in the Journal of Asian Studies, Osiris, the International Journal of Asian Studies, BJHS Themes, East, and the PRC History Review. Other research projects include a history of dam and reservoir construction in 20th century China and a history of China-Indian networks of science circa 1920 to 1980, which again, I think we'll be hearing about in today's session. I'll introduce Kelvin after the speaker's comments. So over to you, Professor Zhou.
Thank you so much, Ning, for the generous introduction. Could you enable share screen?
Yes, of course. Just 1 second.
Sure.
There we go.
we see everything okay? Okay, thank you so much, Ning, for inviting me. And I would also like to thank Kelvin for agreeing to serve as a discussant. And I also like to thank Arunabh, my co-panelist, for reading my book proposal draft last week and for giving really, really helpful comments, which I would actually integrate into the presentation today. So some of you probably have recognize that image, right? The image here is the slogan, time is money, efficiency is life. This billboard is a landmark in the Shekou industrial zone. So where is Shekou? If you follow the map here, it is located on the west coast of Shenzhen, China's first and most successful special economic zone. So this zone is very small. It's only 2 square kilometers in size, but it's even more experimental than Shenzhen itself. It was established in January 1979, so it's more than 1 year before the official launch of the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone. It was the first test tube in socialist China that accepted foreign investment. So perhaps somehow ironically, people use the Maoist militaristic language to compare the explosion that leveled the hills in Shekou at the beginning of its construction as quote unquote the pause-breaking gunfires of reform. So the recognition it received, especially at the 40th anniversary of reform, does not deny the controversies at its creation. Some conservative Chinese Communist Party elites oppose the idea and compare, special economic zones to the foreign concessions made by China during the century of humiliation and warn against the dangers of extraterritoriality and deprivation of tariff autonomy. So sovereignty is the first key word in my presentation today. In the 19th century, imperialist infringement on Chinese sovereignty through treaty ports and foreign concessions has been central to the state's narrative of 100 years of national humiliation. So fast forward to our contemporary moment of assertive Chinese power and prosperity. So Chinese investors generate anomalous forms of sovereignty in special economic zones abroad through the Belt and Road Initiative. So in the 21st century, Chinese run zones in Southeast Asia, such as the one you see here on your left-hand side, it's from Nuri study on Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone at the Thai-Burma border, right? Or in Africa, such as Qingguang Li's study on the Chinese zones on the Copper Belt in Zambia. The PRC enterprises reproduce Chinese style of labor discipline management and what Benedict Anderson would call regalia of the Chinese state on a foreign territory, such as Chinese language, road signs, and slogans. So the historical moment I want to focus on today, the early reform era, is situated between China's past as a victim of Western imperialism and present when it's treated by some Western observers as an agent of new colonialism itself. So I want to discuss 2 entangled questions. The first is about China's relations with the international economy. So is the global marketplace a source of danger that should be kept at arm's length, or a dynamo that will stimulate China's economic growth? And secondly, in face of shifting international circumstances, how does the state's role in the economy change? So a long lineage of scholarship has shed light on the emergence of economic elites with mixed identities, such as comprados, merchant officials, or official merchants in the late 19th century, particularly in treaty ports in coastal China. So what kind of new elites with fused functions emerge in Shekou? And how do they tell us about the making and the remaking of state-market relationship at a special economic zone, or some sociologists call a hinge for linking socialist and capitalist spaces? So to answer these 2 questions, I'm going to focus on one company, the China Merchants Group, one person, one character, Yuan Geng, and one industrial zone, that is Shekou. So let's start with the company. So probably some of us are familiar with the China Merchant Steamship Navigation Company, which was important modern shipping enterprise originally established by Li Hongzhang, Qing official in 1872. So in face of intensifying Sino-foreign rivalry, the Qing state intervened in the commercial sphere, supporting a commercial shipping firm under the Qing flag to track the rapid development of foreign enterprise. The founding of the China Merchant Steamship Navigation Company indicated the emergence of a new relationship between the state and merchants in the form of officially supervised merchant managed or 官督商办. Not to Arunabh for mentioning this literature to me. So the China merchants actually perform transportation services for the state at a discounted or favorable rate, and also competed with foreign shipping companies on major routes. The Qing government, on the other hand, helped the company maintain a de facto monopoly with their treaty port network. So these are pictures from the China Merchants Group Historical Museum in Shekou. So during the Republican era, the China Merchants remained a viable and significant steamship company until the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. After the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War, the China Merchants' operation in mainland China became nationalized. The underground CCP members in the Hong Kong branch of the China Merchants revolted and they pledged allegiance to the PRC. So into the 1970s, China Merchants' business performance was very poor, and its market presence in Hong Kong was almost dismissible when compared to shipping magnates such as Dong Haoyun and Bao Yugang. So in 1978, Yuan Geng, who had spent 5 years as a political prisoner during the Cultural Revolution, was rehabilitated and appointed as the head of the Hong Kong office of the China Merchants Group. Yuan put forward a bold proposal to Beijing, requesting the central government to authorize the China Merchants Group to develop an industrial zone in the neighboring Shekou. So who is Yuan Gong? I often say that there is one spy that traveled from my first book to my second book, and his name is Yuan Geng. So Yuan Geng was a guerrilla fighter during the Second Sino-Japanese War. He was an intelligence agent based in Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 60s. So he named two of his eldest children, both born in Indonesia, as Zhongyin, which means China-Indonesia, and Nia, which is a transliteration of Nisha from Indonesia. Yuan was credited for exposing the Chinese nationalist government in Taiwan's assassination plot against Zhou Enlai during the Bandung Conference of 1955. So here we see Yuan hold, with another baby. This is not his own child. This is baby Guanghua. So baby Guanghua was named after the ship Guanghua, on which he was born. So in October 1965, Yuan was dispatched to Indonesia to facilitate the repatriation of over 5,000 ethnic Chinese expelled by the local government in the aftermath of Indonesia's 1965 to 1966 anti-communist mass killing and the following deterioration of Sino-Indonesia diplomatic relations. So on your left-hand side, we see Yuan holding the Little Red Book, quotations of Chairman Mao, on the deck of Guanghua in 1966. Side by side with him, almost 30 years later, in Western-style suit, on the decker of Guanghua's sister ship, the Minghua. So Yuan's experience of escorting the Chinese Indonesian refugees on the Guanghua in the 1960s helped him to come up with the idea of repurposing the Minghua, which is a retired cruise ship China purchased from France, as a 5-star hotel to accommodate an increasing number of foreign investors visiting Shekou in the early 1980s. So how did the Cold War spy master transform into a prominent reformer? So the theme of our drawing seminar today is about China's reform and opening as a process of transnational knowledge production. So we want to emphasize that rather than a one-way flow of information from the Western China, reform was a moment of diverse and multi-directional exchange of ideas. So Arunabh, in his first book, for example, focused on the South-to-South knowledge cross-fertilization. The case of Yuangong and Shekou shows how historical endowments embedded in the clan and commercial networks of the Pearl River Delta and the region's long-standing ties to global capitalism actually enable Shenzhen and Shekou to acquire more modern managerial knowledge under reform. So Yuangong, he is a Hakka Cantonese. He was actually born in Bao'an, which is a geographical predecessor of Shenzhen. So he also spent his prime years in Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, and Pearl River Delta. So he himself was deeply familiar with the trade and diasporic networks of this transnational region called China South by historian Wang Gongwu. And the commercial networks that connect the treaty regimes on China's southeast coast to Southeast Asia in the age of imperialism later transformed into transnational revolutionary networks in the 1930s and 40s. So channeling left-wing intellectuals and Chinese language, Marxist, print media, and so on. So for example, as Jason Kelly's recent research shows, I'm not sure Jason will be here. So his really fascinating book, Market Maoist, the first chapter actually tells the story how during the Second World War and early Cold War period, there was a convergence of the CCP trade and intelligence network. So the CCP's commercial work in the capitalist control areas must be quote unquote secretive, more akin to intelligence operations than open propaganda work. So it is indeed not a surprise that a spy from the code like Yuangong would become a business leader under reform. So in 1986, Yuangong was invited to give a lecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. At opening of his talk, he joked, "I welcome your criticism and suggestions. Maybe at the end of my talk, I will gain more than you do, because I'm a businessman, and businessmen usually take advantage of scholars." So under reform, the China Merchants Group transformed from the Guandu Shangban, officially supervised merchant managed enterprise into a state-owned enterprise. So its leader, Yuangong, embodied a new type of, you may say, merchant official or official merchant, who mediated between the state and the market, the domestic and the foreign. Yuan was a firm believer in market mechanism and the importance of integrating China into the global economy. However, his angle was not just about profit making. So in his Hong Kong talk, for example, Yuan kind of rhetorically asked his audience, is Shekou Thomas More's utopia or Tao Yuanming's peach blossom spring? No, Shekou is a test tube. Yuan's economic vision for Shekou with its geographical proximity to Hong Kong and very good natural port conditions was to strategically place this zone in the increasingly globalized process of production and build an externally oriented, sustainable model of economic growth. So for example, he banned entry port trade between Shekou and interior China, as well as compensation trade from foreign investors, because he believed these projects are very short-sighted and detrimental to Shekou's long-term development. He was also very sensitive to the rising global interest in the South China Sea oil and the expansion of container shipping. So Yuan initiated the container manufacture business in Shekou, and he also started infrastructure building that will make Shekou into a key oil service center in South China and a popular residential area for foreign oil executives, such as the villas here you see. In 1983, Shekou became China's poster industrial zone with the youngest population. The average age was 24 and a half, the highest level of education. So 70% of the managers or cadres receive college degree. And also the highest pay for workers is about 800 Hong Kong dollar per month, which was higher than the average in Macau, zero unemployment rate and zero felonies. Although Yuan said in his Hong Kong speech that Shekou was not a utopia, he did envision a social democracy on a community level with not only the physical infrastructure such as affordable housing, high quality public education, public space for the leisure of the working class, but also kind of soft infrastructure such as free press. So the newspaper you see here, 蛇口通讯 or 蛇口 News, 蛇口 Bulletin, often start open discussions about democracy. And it also published criticism against the China Merchant Group higher management, including Yuan Geng himself. Yuan was also very adamant in removing political hierarchy and put great emphasis on investment in human capital. So he saw workers as participating citizens, not as laborers. And he encouraged the building of an inclusive democratic social space and supported civic associations such as media salon, as you can see here, and also pressure groups. He believed that essence of reform and opening is to implement a high degree of socialist democracy. And China, according to him, will ultimately head towards universal election. And Shekou is better equipped than any other place in China to initiate democratic reform. So here we see pictures of annual elections of the management committee of the Shekou Industrial Zone. And these are mobile ballot boxes that will actually go on site to offices, factories, and even the Minghua ship, as you can see here, so that the Shekou residents did not need to take a leave from work to vote. And the members of the board of directors at the China Merchants Group were also subjected to annual vote of confidence or no confidence. So before each voting, the candidates would give a speech and answer questions from the public. So I conclude here. So after the end of the World War II, we witnessed the universalization of the nation state. At the same time, we also see the emergence of anomalous and ambiguous forms of sovereignty. These spaces in which normal rules of the states are suspended or given different names by philosophers, sociologists, and historians, such as state of exception, archipelago capitalism, graduated sovereignty, the off-shell world, or extra statecraft. So my presentation today showcased the long genealogy of zones in the Chinese context, from the late 19th century treaty ports, foreign concessions that became symbols of national humiliation, to a reform era special economic zones that serve as laboratory to test out market-oriented policies before introducing them to the core of the planned economy, and then to the 21st century industrial zones or industrial parks in the BRI scheme that serve as a vehicle for an assertive Chinese power globally. Throughout history, zones have been a highly contested site for Sino-foreign interactions, demonstrating different dynamics between the domestic and foreign, the market and the state. So in his recent review essay published on The Nation, I think Andy Liu, he argues that the flip side of the extreme financialization of economic life in Euro-American context was the state-led industrialization of East Asia. As he rightly pointed out, the export processing zones, sorry, it was my husband, the export processing zones in Asia and offshore tax havens in post-colonial territories have only been incorporated into the formerly Euro-American centric studies of neoliberalism, which had narrowly focused on the ideology of Chicago or Vienna-based economists. So I hope my presentation today restore a vision of modernity by a Chinese revolutionary that promise a different future from today's global neoliberal order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhou. Professor Ghosh, would you like to proceed with your presentation?
Great, thank you, Ning, and thank you so much, Taomo. That was really, really fantastic. And thanks to, again, thank you, Ning, and to Kelvin, both for the invitation and then for so generously willing to serve as a discussant. What I'm going to do, I think, is slightly different, but I hope it will complement well what Taomo has just done, which is not so much a case study, but try and sort of give you a sense of some of the broader thoughts that I've been having as I've been working on my project itself. But before I even dive into that, I just wanted to reflect for a second on sort of the interesting moment we are in right now, as of 2 days ago, I think, in terms of discussing reform in global history, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how much of, I think, the world as we know it is likely to change in the weeks, months, and years to come, and the kinds of historical analogies that it lends itself to. The most ominous analogy that I've seen on Twitter right now is comparisons with World War I, actually, or the lead up to World War I in some ways. So thinking about then how ideas of reform and ideas of sort of alliances and transnational connections can be so easily affected by this. And of course, the more proximate prompt for thinking about these things, of course, is the fact that this is February, this year, February is the 50th anniversary of Nixon's visit to China. So there's an interesting sort of reflection going on within, I think, several communities, but in particular, the Chinese foreign relations community and the US foreign relations community on sort of what the legacy of that has been, and if there is more much to celebrate or now much to perhaps lament, as some American commentators have said, and so on. But I think what's interesting, thinking about sort of the ways in which geopolitics can have an effect on thinking about reform and thinking about knowledge exchange. What you saw, I think, in very broad terms, in reductive terms in the 70s, is an alignment, a shift in alignment that brought the US and China closer, in some ways to the detriment of Russia. And we're seeing a new kind of triangular realignment taking place now. So there's just some broad things, I think, to keep in mind as we discuss as we continue our discussion. But what I'm going to do today, I'm going to follow the rule of three, I guess, and try and divide my talk into my comments into three parts. First, I'll tell you very briefly about what I'm working on, and focus in particular on a part of that that's relevant to the discussion today, which is sort of thinking about reform as global history. I'll then describe in very brief terms the way I'm trying to sort of understand the various approaches to the reform period that are now slowly crystallizing. And Taomo gave us sort of already hinted at some of these approaches, and I'm going to try and give you a synthetic assessment. And of course, this is very sort of rough, and I'd love to hear feedback, and I'd love to hear if people have things that we should add and so on. And then finally, I'll mention very briefly the sort of a half-baked project idea that I'm now beginning to play with, which I would love to pursue. It'll have to be a larger sort of team effort, I think, a group sort of project. But it's still very much sort of a pie in the sky kind of thing. But the only thing I have for it is a title, and which is sort of China in the world and the world in China. But I'll tell you what I mean by the end of my comments. So the first part, what am I working on right now? In brief, I'm trying to write a history of hydropower and dam building in 20th century China. And the hope is really to track the history or the story of the story of hydropower in China, from China's first hydropower project, which was built actually in the late Qing. It came online in the first year of the Republic. So it came on in 1912, just outside of Kunming. So from that sort of originary moment, try and take the story all the way to the 80s, and if possible, even further, depending on how things go with archival access and research access and so on. But a central puzzle for me has been how to capture this history while being attentive to this question of scale. Now, typically, when we think about China and we think about dams, we think of mega projects, the sort of the gargantuan projects that immediately occupy our imagination. And most recently, Three Gorges is the sort of totemic example of that, which began, as many of you know, producing electricity in 2012. But if you look at sort of the broader reality, then you discover that since the 1980s, China has been building large dams at an unprecedented pace. By one estimate, China today accounts for 40% of the world's large dams. To give you what that means in terms of numbers, that's about 24,000 large dams are in China today. And this is, I'm using a definition that the International Commission on Large Dams uses, which is that anything higher than 15 meters is counted as a large dam. So 24,000, i.e. 40% of the world's large dams are in China today. And the other part of the story, of course, is then since the early 2000s, China has become a global leader in exporting this technology abroad to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, Latin America, and various parts of Africa. This is a relatively well-known story. It's been written about, remarked. What I've been discovering is a flip side to the story that is extremely, to me at least, extremely intriguing. And that is, and for that, I want to take you very briefly to a conference that was held in late 1979 in Montreal, organized by the UN, a bunch of oil companies, I think a Canadian oil company, and other international organizations. And the purpose was really to take stock of the world's energy production, the sources of energy production, and sort of what the prospects were, what the challenges were. And you can, understand what the global context for this was. Of course, you have it was sort of in the wake of two oil shocks, the first one in the early 70s, and then in 1979 itself with what was going on in Iran. So there's sort of a real sort of attempt to grapple with fossil fuel dependence in some ways. Hydropower was among the technologies, the sources of energy that was discussed. But most of the speakers came from those countries that had sort of an extensive investment in hydropower at that time. So these are countries in Scandinavia, places like Norway, Sweden, and so on, and the US, which had a heavy investment in hydropower at that time. This is the late 70s, right? But what was striking was that in all of their remarks, they mentioned, rather they sort of noted both with surprise and with admiration that they had just discovered that China had actually built by this time 90,000 small-scale hydropower stations. And by small, this is typically thought of as extremely small, 500 kilowatts or thereabouts, right? So we're talking about not even sort of middling in terms of scale. And then they also noted that these 90,000 small hydro stations contributed as much as 1/3 of China's total electricity generation at this time. It sort of shifts the picture around from a lot of the discourse that we have of China at this particular point opening up and being a seeker of knowledge to suddenly China being actually a master in a particular kind of very specialized technology that has, in 1979, in that moment of fossil fuel induced kind of tensions, a serious possibility as an alternative way forward. So I want to give you a sense also of why China stood out so much. So just a few more interesting data points. So in 1979, the estimate is 90,000 small hydropower stations. By contrast, even as late as the mid-1980s, estimates from other countries in Asia, so 9 other countries in Asia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nepal, Pakistan, Philippines, Sri Lanka, combined had less than 300 small hydropower stations. Right, so the contrast is striking, and even those countries that had a heavy investment in large hydropower, the US most notably, had a very, very small number of small hydropower stations, only about 1,200. So there is this recognition in 1979. The UN gets involved, a bunch of other countries in the global south become extremely involved, and you see a series of conferences in 79, 80, 81, into the 80s that are centered on the circulation of this, essentially this kind of expertise. And I have some wonderful, I don't have them prepared today, but I have these wonderful statements from different Chinese companies, essentially county level organizations, making fantastic claims about, not fantastic, making very impressive claims about the kinds of expertise they have and what they can offer to other countries. And a lot of this activity culminates in 1981 with the establishment of a dedicated training center in Hangzhou for small hydropower. And this center is still very much active today, and they've trained I think several hundreds of people from a broad range of countries. So why is this this flip side story kind of interesting? Well, most obviously, it offers an interesting contrast to the standard model, as I just suggested, which is much more of China as a sort of sponge soaking in everything that is to learn from the rest of the world, but also the manner in which it is soaking in, as it were. And I think Taomo just mentioned Andy Liu's fantastic essay that just came out, and he does a review of Jason Kelly and Isabella Weber's book. And Isabella Weber is sort of, I think, part of this debate in some ways, where she's trying to understand how this process took place at the level of economic policymaking, marketization, price controls, and things like that. And then he contrasts it very briefly, Andy does, but I think this is a comparison that makes sense, or a contrast that makes sense with Julian Gewürz's book that came out a few years ago, which also offers a particular model of engagement, but is more, I think, based on an uncritical adoption of a certain kind of paradigm. And Weber's is a much more sort of complex story of negotiation, circulation of global knowledge, and so on. So as I said, the case of small hydropower in the late 70s points to a sort of an additional sort of layer to the story, which is sort of China as expert. And then how do we account for this particular sort of development also? So I want to transition very quickly to the second part of what I wanted to say, which is sort of how then what are the different frameworks that exist for looking at this reform period, and how do we even begin to periodize it and things like that. So in sort of my very rough and kind of back to the envelope kind of attempt to sort of categorize these works, I've come up with sort of a 4 or 5-fold schema. The first one, I think, which builds off of the conversation we just had, Isabella Weber, how China escaped shock therapy, Julian Gewirtz's Unlikely Partners, sort of looking at elite policymaking, economic policy in particular. And this ties in interesting ways with, I think, what Taomo was speaking about the emergence of new kinds of elites, pushing for new kinds of economic policy, or experimenting with new kinds of industrial organization, economic organization, and so on. So that's, I think, one area that's seen a lot of very interesting new work. The other, and there's an older version of this, which is much more geopolitics centered, right, which has to do with elite leaders thinking geopolitically. But there's interesting new work in this connection that I think has some bearing on the geopolitics story. And I'm thinking in particular of Covell Maiskin's book on the Third Front and Third Front construction, sort of the tremendous investment in industrialization, mostly in the interior, starting in the mid-1960s, and fueled by geopolitical concerns, essentially fueled by concerns about a two-front war that the Chinese would have to fight the US along the coast and the Soviets inland, that led to a sort of a reallocation of resources and the emergence of new kinds of capacity in not what one might think of as non-traditional centers. So there's the geopolitics story, but with an interesting possible twist. The third one, and here I think there's a lot of diverse work going on, is sort of this grassroots structural kind of approach, which looks at, again, the traditional story, which is, these farmers in Anhui coming up with a compact and moving towards household responsibility, and that then gets recognized by the center. That's the traditional story. But we're seeing sort of a whole plethora of new approaches that are, I think, quite fascinating in terms of the richness of detail and the specificities. But again, if I were to try and, again, be reductive and divide, then I can think of two broader approaches. One is sort of this dynamism on the boundaries, sort of exchanges, activity, and Taomo, what she described with Shirko is a great example of that. But I'm also thinking of Denise Ho's work. Philip Thais looked at sort of financialization, for instance. Sort of looking at sort of how the periphery becomes this zone of contact, experimentation. You can channel, I guess, Richard White in Middle Ground in interesting ways also, I guess, in this. The other is sort of more structural internal changes that sort of emerge. And here I'm thinking of work by Arne Westad, who's looked at the structure of communes and how they are changing and how they create certain kinds of capacities that then, when and opening up when opening up takes place, they're able to capitalize on a lot of that. And there's also interesting work by a recent Harvard PhD, Adam Frost, who's looked at sort of the prevalence of black markets and speculation in socialist China. And again, the fact that there is a lot of this kind of pent-up energy to appropriate market-based practices if they become available. So that's the third one. The fourth one, moving along very quickly, is sort of this broad area of knowledge exchange, and this is partly what I'll speak to more in a bit. And this, again, you can think of in terms of sort of technical exchanges in technical areas, industrial areas, sort of very sort of focused, instrumentalized, applied knowledge. But then there's also, I think, a tremendous amount of activity that is in disciplinary knowledge, so sort of in the what you can call the hard sciences or the disciplinary social sciences and sciences that is taking place, and this, I think, is something that is also as much a part of the story. And then finally, of course, there is I think Taomo did this very nice sort of connecting it to earlier moments, right? Sort of earlier, sort of the legacies of earlier practices that have an impact in the reform era. I think there's a similar kind of way in which we can think about China as the expert, or China as the source of expertise, because you have an earlier Cold War story of China, Chinese aid projects in various parts of Africa, some in the Caribbean also, but that's mostly a story of the 60s and early 70s, and you don't see it as part of the story of the late 70s and of the reform era. And I think partly inspired by the small hydropower story, I think there is a whole way in which we need to think about what is going on in a range of activities where China is already offering a way forward. And if there's time in the Q&A, I can give at least one other example that I have that speaks to, again, something where the Chinese are offering a certain kind of expertise. So, okay, and then very quickly, I know we were only given 10 minutes, so I'm gonna try and wrap up with the third part. So partly inspired by the small hydropower story, and as I said, the other instances that I've located, I would love to sort of see, and this would have to be a collective effort, see what did sort of, or ask, what did opening up mean in terms of knowledge production? And I don't think we should start in 78, but I think really start with 1971 when China rejoins the UN, the PRC joins the UN, because that, I think, was sort of an opening of a tap in some ways for the circulation of a whole range of Chinese sort of experts and domain experts in some ways. So I would love to sort of see this, and this is why I said this would be, but the important thing would be, of course, also of the kinds of sort of connections that are being made globally. So this is attendance at conferences, at workshops, but also all kinds of delegations from the national to the provincial to the county level that become possible over time. And then, of course, also the tremendous sort of range of people who begin to visit China after 1971. I think there is sort of a qualitative change. So to try and map that in some ways, and that's why I sort of framed it as China in the world and the world in China in some ways as a project. It's, again, an interesting time to think about this. I don't know if some of you saw, Vivian Wang had an article in the New York Times, I think just yesterday, which talks about sort of the closing of China in some ways, right? In as much as the reform era was a period of openness, what we're seeing now is a very self-conscious closing down of a whole range of connections and whole range of sort of ways in which conversations could take place. So I'll end with just why I think such a project, and I'm happy to talk more about how one might even think about going about this, but why something like this, what the payoffs of this kind of reconstruction might be. And this would be sort of at a very basic level, building a database and then going out from there. For one, it would provide a fuller record of the diversity of the interactions that did take place from 1971 onwards itself, and allow us to discover what we often miss when we focus on one set of interactions, or bilateral interactions, or a particular individual going to a particular place. I think this would sort of open up and allow us to see things as part of a process, as part of a series of connected events. Also, I think it would give a better sense of the internal dynamics of the opening up and of the changes taking place. So the different levels of the state that are involved, how those decisions get made, and how that decision making changes over time, especially as restrictions are relaxed. So sort of an internal almost story of the state and how the state's adapting to these changes. Both of these things would allow us to generate varied timelines that can tell us more nuanced stories about developments in different fields. So how are certain domains being internationalized, and at what pace and at what time? And then finally, I think it would put back in the story sort of China as a major sort of producer of global best practices into this conversation, which I think has been missing, and in some ways I think therefore generates this kind of surprise in the contemporary moment, where you have this sort of like, oh wow, all of this innovation is coming from China. I mean, that's not really the aberration. It's like we have to think about the diversity of innovation and the way in which it has been thought throughout the long 20th century in some ways. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry these comments are very general, but I'm hoping that since it's supposed to be an open discussion, they can be generative for both comments and feedback and an open discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think open comments are very much the way to go for the session. So thank you for that. Let me just try to make sure that the recording is working all right. So before we open the floor up to discussion, Kelvin is here to kick us off by responding to the two presentations that we just heard. Kelvin is a PhD candidate in history at Yale University. His research interests broadly lie in the history of imperialism and anti-imperialism in the early 20th century Indian Ocean Circuit. Specifically, Kelvin's current research project is situated between intellectual history and labor history, with a focus on forms of unfree labor migration, including slavery, indenture, prison labor, and debt bondage that emerged to be generative of new spaces, novel forms of thought, and radical political claims around race, caste, nationality, and sovereignty. Ultimately, Kelvin is interested in further studying the implications and intersections between anti-colonial, intellectual, artistic, and political projects emerging from such cosmopolitan port cities as Bombay, Singapore, Durban, Hong Kong, Aden, and Zanzibar, among others. More broadly, he has a strong interest in Marxism and its global itineraries, histories of the left, capitalism and political economy, modern political thought, post-colonial theory, and continental philosophy. And he is developing a very fascinating dissertation project that I've had the great privilege of hearing a lot about, which I hope will be fertile ground for his interlocution today. Kelvin joined the Yale History Department in 2019. Prior to coming to Yale, he obtained his BA and MA degrees at Columbia University, and he was born in Penang, Malaysia, and raised in Singapore. Kelvin, over to you.
Of course, thank you so much, Ning, for the introduction, and thank you to both Professor Zhou and Professor Ghosh for your really fascinating presentations. I've only had a chance to take some very rudimentary notes on both your presentations, but I think that here you're well poised to really make a major intervention in how the history of the reform period is interpreted in the discipline of history. So that bio is perhaps somewhat outdated. I think that the course of my graduate education has led me to an increasing interest in thinking about inter-Asia connections, and especially thinking about the 70s and 80s as a moment of really global reform between Southeast Asia, South Asia, and China. I am now really interested in thinking more about this period as a period of the reorganization of international political economy, particularly from the perspective of the global South. And I think that here, Professor Zhou, both Professor Zhou and Professor Ghosh's upcoming work is really going to sort of reorient how we think about this reform and opening up period in important ways. With Professor Zhou importantly highlighting the shifting nature of state sovereignty and spatial configurations in China, and Professor Ghosh's work really trying to sort of like position China as a major producer of best practices through looking at connections that are being made globally after 1971. So here I am going to adhere as well to the rule of thirds, and I'm going to sort of perhaps divide my comment up into three main chunks. The first is perhaps inviting you to situate your work in relation to the broader historiography on neoliberalism and neoliberalization. And secondly, to perhaps speak a bit more to the historiography of China's reform era or post-socialist era, as Professor Ghosh has so kindly sort of oriented our attention to it. And thirdly, to situate your work in relation to what has been termed by some scholars as the infrastructural turn or the logistical turn. And I'll be talking about the different valences that are attached to special economic zones versus hydropower and dam infrastructure that emerges in this emerging body of scholarship, mainly from anthropology and geography, but I think has wide resonance across the discipline of history as well. Ning, if I go over 10 minutes, please feel free to stop me, because I'm sure that the audience has plenty of questions for our professors as well. So first, on the historiography of neoliberalism and neoliberalization writ large, I was really intrigued at how your work also poses a challenge to existing models of understanding pathways of neoliberalization processes. So in the most general sense, neoliberalization perhaps denotes a sort of intensification of market rule and commodification. And there's a sort of veritable sort of body of scholarship around marketization and commodification, which emerged really through the unevenly developed institutional landscapes of the 1970s. Most of this work, as Professor Ghosh has alluded to, has converged on Reagan's America and Thatcher's Britain, but there has been recent work that has attempted to look at neoliberalism from the perspective of Anwar Sadat's Egypt or Pinochet's Chile. So here I want to just sketch out three traditions of heterodox political economy that has allowed us to really interpret the geographies and pathways of neoliberalization. The first being the varieties of capitalism school, the second being more historical materialist interpretations of international political economy, and the third being scholarship on governmentality. So the first school of varieties of capitalism perhaps provides different sets of empirical tools for thinking about the different operations of global capital. And here, one might think of Michael Albert's distinction between American and Rhinish capitalisms, which really open up this discussion on varieties of capitalism. One might observe that this remains a very methodologically nationalist framework, because they view neoliberalism as a national regime type that's like confined to market economies. And there's an inability to grasp patterns of market-driven regulatory restructuring that really intersect between different national regulatory systems, except as evidence of perhaps convergence or interaction. And here I think that Professor Ghosh and Professor Zhou's work both offers a very important sort of corrective to this methodological nationalism, to the varieties of capitalism school. And it allows us to think about how neoliberalization processes intensify rather than alleviate these institutional forms of differentiation at different scales. Another sort of characteristic of this school is that there's a sort of very equilibrium-based understanding of institutional change. However, I think that what Professor Zhou has also pointed out is that neoliberalization processes unfold through really both contingent and incremental adjustments, and these effects are systematically transformative. They undermine any sort of idea of staticity in processes of institutional change. And here, I think I would perhaps like to hear you speak a bit more about how you're situating your work in relation to this sort of varieties of capitalism school of historical scholarship. The other major school that has emerged in sort of scholarship on neoliberalization has been perhaps a historical materialist perspective on international political economy. So really emphasizing the global supranational parameters of neoliberalization, thinking about neoliberalism as a global disciplinary regime, and looking at how global and multilateral institutions have empowered transnational capital while limiting the power of nation states to shape the conditions of investment within their borders. So you have your paradigmatic sort of formulation of state against market. However, this really leaves empirically underdetermined the differential and uneven impacts of neoliberalization processes upon national and subnational sort of spaces. And I think that here, I would like to invite both Professor Zhou and Professor Ghosh to talk about the politics of zoning and the politics of speciality when it comes to thinking about neoliberalization as a sort of as a process that unfolds across various spatial scales. Another sort of perhaps shortcoming of this way of mode of interpretation that's been offered by this sort of international political economy approach is also that there are neoliberalization attempts are often sort of thought of as it's often thought of as perhaps entirely rupturous. So it's said to trigger entirely new dislocations or disruptions. And here, I think that what Professor Zhou and Ghosh, in sort of reorienting the timeline of neoliberalism in China, is importantly sort of arguing is that there are deep continuities between, say, hydropower construction attempts in the late Qing period, or the first attempts at grappling with the question of merchant capitalism in the late Qing period, with what eventually occurs in the 70s reform and opening up period. So here, these are distinct yet interdependent pathways of neoliberalization that are forged through different waves of experimentation at different scales. And perhaps I would just like to invite you to speak a bit more on that as well. But the third broad school of thinking about neoliberalization has been to think about governmentality and neoliberalism as a perhaps technology of rule. It's said to result from the infiltration of market-driven logics and forces and calculations into the domain of politics as the everyday conduct and political strategies across different sites of everyday life. And one might associate this with the work of Wendy Brown, Melinda Cooper, etc. Here, the uneven development of neoliberalism is understood as a very contingent process that occurs in dispersed sites. However, I would say that this sort of school really neglects to analyze the context of context, which is how the sort of macro-spatial landscapes within which these programs of neoliberalism are articulated and forged. And they really sort of, it really sort of underdetermines their sort of shared macro-spatial parameters. It also, in the emphasis on how these forms of neoliberalization are unpredictable or haphazard, it also fails to investigate the logics of path dependency and path shaping that really sort of underpin these experiments in neoliberalization, as Professor Ghosh importantly pointed out through his really meticulous excavation of South-South connections and exchanges among different states in this period. So at the same time, what is the value to be gained from really engaging with and taking up this scholarship on governmentality and neoliberalism in regards to China? I would like to perhaps hear a bit more about about that as well in your really exciting upcoming work. So really shifting gears quite quickly to the second sort of broad domain of my comments, which is thinking about the different approaches to China's reform era and the different approaches to thinking about China's post-socialist era. I think that in addition to the 5 different approaches to China's post-reform political economy, I would also sort of sketch out that another contribution of this literature on post-socialist China has been to really sort of emphasize the contending role of the state. So this is sort of apparent in the work of Isabella Weber, for instance, when she traces the different debates among really economists on the question of like shock therapy. But this has been a mainstay on the literature on Chinese neoliberalization from what Ai Hua-ong and Li Zhang dubbed socialism from afar. So here, it's really instructive for questioning the opposition between the socialist state and free market capitalism, of course. But I wonder here, and I would like to invite Professor Ghosh and Professor Zhou to speak a bit more about this, about do we perhaps risk overstating the state's power in containing neoliberalism or effecting neoliberalism by overemphasizing the role of the state? And here, I think that Professor Zhou sort of drawing our attention to this really sort of contradictory predicament of special economic zones and the problem of ambiguous or contradictory forms of sovereignty is really well placed to sort of make an intervention in this emerging body of scholarship thinking about state-market relations in post-socialist China. In other words, perhaps the intellectual task for scholarship on neoliberalism in China today is really to sort of think about how historically and culturally contingent articulations of neoliberal technologies and techniques work out in different settings. So perhaps this invites us to sort of think about a reorientation of how apt or perhaps how inapt the category of neoliberalism or post-socialism is in the context of reform era China. So somewhat attendant to this is that there, in addition to that body of scholarship, there has also been a growing body of scholarship on, the bamboo network and its role in reform era Chinese economic practices. So this is very variously formulated as Confucian capitalism or Guanxi capitalism or overseas Chinese network capitalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, really emphasizing sort of contributions by businessmen in Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, the US, et cetera. So Chinese network capitalism, supposedly in this body of scholarship, challenges the sort of some assumptions of neoclassical economics and the sort of legal contractual emphasis of this body of scholarship. However, I think that here Professor Zhou's sort of intervention into the scholarship is to really think seriously how these links were not simply economic or financial in nature, but really permeated to how these actors were politically involved in decision-making processes. Here, I'm actually reminded, and Professor Zhou also importantly emphasizes that this cannot, as opposed to this body of scholarship, be reduced to a matter of culture. Here, I'm reminded of the word, a comment by Arif Derlik quite some time ago that really, instead of describing Chinese culture, this discourse is actually symptomatic of, a shift in global capitalism towards flexible accumulation, rather than, being a statement on Chinese culture per se. So here, I guess I would just like to invite you to perhaps, in addition to speaking a bit more about your work in relation to the current moment of capitalism and the contradictions we witnessed today, to also perhaps think about how the historical scholarship on neoliberalism in China has emerged in relation to the punctual historical context that it was embedded in, and how does historical conditions structure the possibilities of historical thinking around neoliberalism in China. Now, thirdly, I would just like to briefly comment on your work in relation to infrastructure and logistics. And I think that here, your work really sort of emblematizes 2 distinct approaches to thinking about logistics, because for me, in my view, Professor Ghosh's emphasis on hydropower really sort of underscores the role of infrastructure in processes of production, whether industry or agriculture, whereas Professor Zhou's sort of work on the special economic zones underscores the role of logistics in global networks of circulation and global networks of commerce. Of course, the sort of body of literature on logistics, on the management of like goods, materials, et cetera, has really become like an important touch point in a lot of anthropological literature. There's a wide variety of scholarship that has highlighted the importance of new forms of mobility. Deborah Cohen's seminal The Deadly Life of Logistics, for instance, has really sort of put global logistics at the heart of contemporary transformations in global political economy. So here, I guess I would just like to invite you to talk a bit more about the role of infrastructure and logistics, and thinking a bit more about the materiality of those sort of spaces in relation to your own work. In other words, how is what might add attention to the sort of material and local politics of infrastructure reveal about processes of neoliberalization in post-reform era China? And really, this sort of dimension of material political interest is really sort of present in the production of infrastructure, the sort of which really sort of seeps into the management of capital, the management of political representatives, the sort of civic sphere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I would just like to invite you to perhaps talk a bit more about the varying contending valences that are attached to the logistical turn, and how one might think of the logistical turn and China's increasing role in global supply chain networks in relation to your own work, and whether the logistical turn might be a useful framework for thinking about China's ascendant role in the post-reform era. Here, I'm also reminded of works on how thinking critically about the logistical turn has also really sort of invited us to think about neoliberalization beyond something that's purely technical or purely economical, but really as a key driver of contemporary debates on supply chain capitalism. So my final question to you both then is, what are the political stakes of revisiting this history of neoliberalization in light of really China's sort of dominant role in global supply chain capitalism today? So these are my very sort of brief and rudimentary comments. I apologize in advance for really how rudimentary they are, but thank you both so much for your just really interesting and fascinating presentations.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. Professor Ghosh, Professor Zhou, would you like to respond in some sort of fluid dialogue as we transition towards opening it up to the rest of the floor?
Well, I can. I mean, I can start if Arunabh.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. I'd like to thank Kelvin for this really, really brilliant, eloquent, and spontaneous response. So we're both guilty of not providing Kelvin anything beforehand, and this response is just fantastic. It's really terrific, and it's really inspiring. So thank you so much for all these brilliant ideas. I'm not able to respond to all of them, but let me just start with the part on infrastructure. I really like Deborah Cohen's deadly logistics, right? When you connect military technologies to the kind of expansion of global supply chain. So one of the case I focus in the study of Shenzhen is exactly some kind of similar mechanism. So there on infrastructure, there is also this recent work, people as infrastructure, right? So infrastructure as like social networks. So the case I look at in Shenzhen is the kind of the reuse of the People's Liberation Army, the Maoist soldiers, as the infrastructure of reform. So these soldiers who are they? They're actually the protagonists of Kovo's Sir From book. So these are the basically the construction soldiers who are in the far interior, the remote, secretive military industrial sites, and who are repurposed to build urban infrastructure for market exchanges, global circulation of goods in Shenzhen. And they use kind of a Maoist kind of normative mechanism for labor discipline and mobilization to jumpstart reform. And but in the end, I guess the irony or the sad part of the story is that they also became the kind of the victim, I would say victim, but those who basically bear the cost of the dismantlement of the socialist economic system as the SOEs went through rounds of transformation and reform. So here I'm drawing on the work of Wendy Latour's longstanding work on SOEs, and these workers became kind of laid off and then became basically expelled from the protective shell of the socialist welfare system. So I think in the longer trajectory, China's reform did inspire us to think about infrastructure in a new way, but also regarding the point about neoliberalism, I think there is a large literature discussing Shenzhen SEZ together with all these very what is still called extra statecraft, like all these fancy 21st century SEZs in Abu Dhabi, in the Middle East, right? But as someone who grew up in Shenzhen, I found like there's some kind of inconsistency in the sense that, so I moved to Shenzhen from the socialist heartland of Dongbei in Northeast when I was a teenager. So for me, first and foremost, the special economic zone is a policy tool for the socialist state to dismantle socialist economy, right? So it's similar, as you said, like it's a technology of territorial rescaling, that's true, but also serve this like purpose that is quite different from the rest of the SEZs around the world. So no other SEZ was designed with a border that was meant to disappear. There was a border between Shenzhen and the interior China, it's called Arxin second line, but that line disappeared. Shenzhen emerged from a zone to a metropolitan, right, a city. So that's something I would like to point out. I'll hand over to Arunabh.
Okay, thanks, Taomo, and thank you, Kelvin. This was quite brilliant in terms of the range of topics and the range of sort of conceptual sort of issues that you touched upon. So I'm very grateful to you personally going forward as I think about my own work. Again, as with Taomo, I'm not going to be able to speak about all the fantastic things you raised, but I'll maybe touch upon a few, and then we can see if Yining wants to open it up or maybe have one more round. The first. So I'm going to do this in a slightly scattered way. I was trying to sort of write different things down. But one of the questions you raised was sort of about the place of the state and whether we are sort of overemphasizing the importance of the state. And here I think one of the interesting things that perhaps we need to not so much revisit, but perhaps sort of bring more centrally into the conversation is precisely, so not sort of things like, you know, what is the state, deconstructing the state, not things like that so much as sort of recognition that sort of the neoliberal tradition emerges out of a particular liberal approach to the state, which is really about limiting the state, right? So it is about the individual and protecting the individual rights against transgressions committed by the state. And there's a long genealogy and a long sort of history, both for that kind of thinking, and then the kinds of actual changes on the ground, the policies, the kinds of instruments that emerge out of it. And I think what's interesting is that need not be the only tradition of thinking about state-society relations in some ways. And here my colleague Michael Soni's work comes to mind, right, where he sort of, I think it's called the art of being governed, right? So it is sort of in some ways figuring out, adapting to working with the state, but in working with the state, you actually change the state too, I think. So I think there's sort of a different way in which to think about the diversity of approaches that are there, and then to remind ourselves that these are not necessarily distinct, right? So you have these themselves can often bleed into each other depending on context, time, what is the specific issue being discussed. So I think that's one way forward, to think about a sort of much more capacious way of what the place and role of the state is, and how people as a group or as individuals sort of relate to it, which would take us, I think, which would push us past sort of what a sort of neoliberal understanding would try and push for. And of course, you can think of the market in this context also. Very quickly on infrastructure, I think, and the logistics point that you mentioned, this is again, I think, super interesting, and it does make me think about also the extent to which, we going forward, it'll be very interesting now, given that we might see major realignments thanks to what's going on in Ukraine now, about how infrastructure, you know, yes, it's tied to military technology in some ways, but it in essence is so focused on heavy industry and on what we might think of as primary goods. And that kind of capacity is a very different kind of capacity from sort of the secondary goods, consumer goods, and sort of what are called fast-moving consumer goods, and the kinds of economic relations, the kinds of economic growth that permits. So we might be going through a transitional moment where a certain reinvestment is might take place. This is very speculative in a heavy industry infrastructure type of approach. And that, I think, leads to a very different kind of relationship in terms of what is possible. So again, war making is central to this, but not exclusively so, because I think there are second, third order unintended kinds of consequences. And the dam building example for me is an interesting one here, because one of the things I'm hoping to be able to follow through is the fact that once you have these tens of thousands of projects, in some counties there's several hundreds of them, you are, by virtue of devolving a lot of this authority to the county in terms of building, in terms of maintenance, in terms of running, you are actually over time building a certain kind of capacity to administrative, fiscal, technical, political, all of that. So that's a second order kind of effect that then after 78, 79 leads to a tremendous, what I would like to show is sort of a tremendous growth in, say, township and village enterprises, right? Because you have all these cadre who have all these skills now, and they can rechannel them very, very quickly. So that's sort of one other way to think about it. And then very quickly, finally, on this question of the politics of zoning, I think this is super interesting in terms of how we draw boundaries. And of course, I mean, it's obviously passé to say that the nation state is going to be a defining feature of this. But for me, in some ways, the frontier of this is not so much even terrestrial, but it's aquatic, right? So in thinking really about, so I'm thinking also of the work of someone like Surabhi Ranganathan at Cambridge, who's been doing a lot of interesting work on sort of how the laws of the sea are changing to adjust to these new realities where zoning is really not terrestrial or territorial anymore. And a great example of this in relation to what the PRC has been doing, of course, is the various activities in the South China Sea, both in terms of terraforming, if I can use that phrase, at a subcontinent, planet level, but also in terms of the ways in which they have been investing heavily in sea archaeology, I guess, right, as a way of laying claims. Sovereignty claims. So it comes back in interesting ways to the sovereignty question, to laying sovereignty claims to places that are actually far, far removed territorially from what China is today, right? So again, that's a very interesting redeployment of ideas of sovereignty and zoning in this contemporary context. So okay, I'll stop there. There's so much more to talk about, but thank you again, Kelvin. This was fantastic.
Great. So I'm going to stop the recording here.